fortunate to have Susan DeCamp as our speaker this morning. She is the project coordinator for the Christian Witness for Humanity. It's a very special project created by the Montana Association of Churches to address extremism. She has conducted numerous workshops on Christian identity theology for congregations, community organizations, and clergy. Please welcome Susan DeCamp.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I work for an ecumenical organization, and what ecumenical means is different denominations working together in common effort. And Montana has about 8 different mainline denominations, and they are members of the Montana Association of Churches, and that's the group that I work for. The denominations include Presbyterians, the Roman Catholic Church, Episcopalians, United Methodists, United Church of Christ, and I always forget several, American Baptist Church, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So it's kind of a mix of the mainline denominations, and it's kind of amazing when you can get that many different denominations together, how many things people really do agree on. And so this project was created just a couple of years ago, and it was originally part of a rural revitalization project, recognizing the fact that rural clergy often, when they come into the rural areas in Montana, they're right out of seminary. They probably grew up in an urban area. They don't have a sort of an understanding of what's been going on in crisis and the impact that that's had on small communities. And so we were trying to do some outreach and information around those kinds of issues to help them integrate into the community better, and to also use their position within the community as catalysts for social change. So once we started working on rural issues, it became apparent that extremism was really going like wildfire in rural communities. In our rural communities in Montana, we have a long tradition of John Birch Society membership. And so these places were well set up to be recruited into groups like the Posse Comitatus, and ultimately ending up with what we have today in the Freeman. So it has gone from this rural revitalization into addressing this particular topic in particular, which is Christian identity theology. And most of the time when you say Christian identity, they say, well, whose name is that? Well, it's not our name for them. That's a self-designated term. They chose the handle of Christian identity. Just as white supremacy is a problem that should be addressed and gone after within the white community, we felt that some of the ideas being promoted under the title Christian deserve a response from the Christian community and need to be addressed through those means. So I work with a committee of theologians, and they help me to put together some of the responses, and I go out into rural communities and talk about some of these issues. Okay, we're going to just dive right in. It was the Human Rights Network that first sensitized, the Montana Human Rights Network, sensitized the Montana Association of Churches to the issues involved. And they sent us a little packet of materials. One of them, Leonard Zeskin's book on Christian identity that was adopted by the National Council of Churches. And then some pieces like this from the Ravalli Republic Opinion. It's a newspaper up in Ravalli County that would be around the Bitterroot Valley, south of Missoula. And the editorial is written by Floyd Cochran, who is an ex-Aryan member and has since gone on to start teaching young people about how not to get recruited into skinhead organizations. And here he talks about John Trockman, the leader of the militia of Montana, being at the Aryan Nations compound, talking about the merits of using the Bible and God instead of the swastika and Hitler to advance his brand of racism, bigotry, and Christian identity. Identity teaches God's chosen people are white, people of color are soulless and not quite human, and not citizens of the United States. And it twists the Christian Bible to teach that Jewish people should be exterminated because they are the children of Satan. So starting from there, we started looking into what identity beliefs, how they're centered around, and people want to know, I think the first question is, how do they do that? You know, I've read the Bible, and I sure didn't read that in there, so how do they do that? So that's kind of the first thing we're going to go into. We only have an hour, so I'm going to kind of be racing through this. I hope I don't skip anything. If I get ahead of you, or if I jump ahead too much, go ahead, and then we'll save the question. Call me back, and then again we'll do some questions. Christian identity is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's a new arrival on the scene. So it's one of those arguments you can use. You know, the Bible's been around for a long time, and all of a sudden we have Christian identity, which is the truth. So how did they come up with some of these ideas? The first idea that identity was founded on is something called British Israelism. And British Israelism was an idea that came from the second book of Kings in the Bible. And if you read the second book of Kings, it talks about the tribes of Israel being divided into north and south. This seems like such a small screen. Well, it's not important to read the words more or less, but just to notice this, to see the map. The second book of Kings has been historically placed at about 721 BC in the Bible. And it describes the tribes of Israel being divided into north and south. Well, in the Bible, it talks about these northern tribes having adopted the gods of the tribes around them. God was angry with them. He allowed the Assyrians to conquer them and absorb them, and they disappeared. Well, British Israelism maintained that they didn't really disappear. What they did was they migrated. They managed to retain their identity and travel, and it has all these routes going all over. And somehow all of them managed to break up into this migration and all of a sudden reconvene in Northern Europe. So the tribes of Israel are the original founders of Northern Europe, and Israelites are white Northern Europeans. This idea, well, they back this up with some interesting scholarship. I have a book here. It's called Your Inheritance, the Best Kept Secret in the World. And it's kind of like a recruiting tool. It's the lure of the arcane, this secret knowledge, something you've never heard before, but usually there's a good reason why you've never heard it before. And they talk about how they established this migratory route and the evidence of these folks ending up in Northern Europe. And they relied primarily on circumstantial and linguistic type evidence. The tribes of Dan became Denmark, things like that. And heraldic evidence, you know, like because this country uses this symbol on their flag, you can trace that symbol back to Israel. It's pretty bad, but it's complex. And as they go through what they consider their evidence, they have all sorts of works cited. They refer to books by scholarly people who sound like they have tremendous credentials. But if you look at the works cited in these kinds of works, you find that the timeline on some of these things they're quoting from is about late 1800s, early 1900s. And you know, there's a large body of scholarship, and people are giving it their best shot. They've got a great theory, they pull together some evidence, they put it out there, and sometimes it flies and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes this layer of scholarship is going to say, well, this didn't really back that up. So this comes out down by the wayside. And what they rely on are these kinds of works. They're generally around 1800s, early 1900s, to substantiate their claims about the Israel migratory routes. So if you go back into these books and you read them, go into the works cited, look them up, find out what it is they're quoting from. It's that same kind of scholarship that they use to construct common law courts and all the other things that we see manifesting themselves, particularly in the Freemen. British Israelism, the idea of it migrated to the United States in the 1800s, and it didn't kind of languished here. It didn't catch on really until around the 1920s, 1930s, when we had this wonderful rise in white supremacy, and the Ku Klux Klan took off in amazing numbers. And when they heard this idea about white Northern Europeans being the true Israel, naturally they like that, so they'll co-opt that piece of it. But British Israelists were not intrinsically anti-Semitic. They felt like the Jews were our fellow brother Israelites, and that one day we'd all be one big happy Israelite family again. So it wasn't until it migrated to the United States that it took on that distinct anti-Semitic tone. And they were helped along in that by people like Henry Ford and his publisher William Cameron, who came out with The International Jew at that time in the 1930s, a book that relied on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Is everybody here familiar with the protocols? No? No, okay. Let's talk about the protocols. This is just from the Reader's Digest. This book has been floating around It was written by a Frenchman attacking the Napoleonic government in France at that time. He claimed that they were using the banks and the government to enslave French people. A Russian bureaucrat got a hold of it about the time Tsar Nicholas was having so many difficulties with the peasants, and they changed the names around to target the Jews as being the scapegoats for the problems of Russia. So I read one time that Tsar Nicholas wasn't really, he thought that was a little bit low and didn't want to use it, but it was out there, it was used, and Hitler got a hold of a copy and used it when he was demonizing the Jews in Nazi Germany. So this book is a proven forgery.
Is that the first time that the Jews were identified and ostracized as the enemy?
Oh, no. No. The protocols, were in the 1800s, 1900s. But as far as anti-Semitism, that goes back to the beginning of Christianity. And there is another good reason for churches to be involved in these kinds of issues, because it's not just the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church themselves. Martin Luther came out with an incredible tract on Jews and the conspiracy and their lies. And so the Christian community has a lot to answer for when it comes to Jewish conspiracy theories. And most of the stuff that's getting cycled around now is rehash from way back when. The Jews being responsible for the plagues in Europe. This one, the Jews and their lies, being promoted using Martin Luther. So those kinds of things are still around. So using things like the protocols, the anti-Semitic component is tacked on to the idea of the Israelites being the true chosen people of God, and the Jews have become now the imposters who are trying to usurp our title and steal it away from us. So when the white Northern Europeans migrated to the United States, this all becomes the part of the migration of Israel. And Israel is in the United States, and the United States is the new promised land. And the founding fathers take on the aspect of a Moses, and that they put together our Constitution. And the Constitution becomes like a sacred document. And that is the organic Constitution by original Israelite forefathers, which only goes up to the 10th Amendment. And of course, women and minorities didn't get the right to vote until after the 10th Amendment. So when they talk that organic constitution or state citizenship, that is an intrinsically white supremacist idea. Because, oh gosh, were any of you in the room when Devin Burkhardt did his exercise on what would happen to the country if white Christian patriots were in charge? Where he had everybody in the room raise your hand. Go ahead, everybody in the room raise your hand. This was so great, I'm going to steal this from Devin. Everybody in the room raise one hand. Okay, now all people of color have to lower their hands. All women have to lower their hands because women would not have the right to vote. All non-Christians lower your hands. So there it is. The last real democracy. And property, oh yeah, you have to own property too. So if you don't own a house or something, it doesn't qualify. So that is the ultimate goal. These guys are very good at pointing out the problems in our government today, and they're also ready to hand out the solution through Christian identity, which is a theocracy. With them in charge and their interpretation of the Bible. This is so hard to see. This is a genealogical chart. This one in particular was from James Aho's book, The Politics of Righteousness, which is a good study of the Christian patriots in Idaho. And it's a genealogical chart that starts out with Adam, Eve, and Satan at the top. This, if you want to go back to the beginning of conspiracy, you have to go back to the very beginning, the beginning of time. Christian identity does a couple of different things to the book of Genesis. Most of the identity teachings you will hear will be focused on Genesis. They spend time on Genesis. And it starts off in Genesis. We're talking about two different creations if you read through the creation stories. The first one is the generalized creation on the first day, on the second day, and he created humankind in his own image, male and female. That's sort of a generalized creation. And then it goes into the specific creation of Adam and Eve. They take that as two distinct and separate creations. It wasn't from the general to the specific. It was he created these humankind, these beings, these pre-existent beings which do not have souls. And then he created Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are souls. They have souls. They are his people, and they are the lineage from which we derive the Israelites. And this is how they do it. Using the King James Version of the Bible, if you read that version, it says that Eve was beguiled by the serpent. And beguile in Hebrew also means to seduce, according to their Strong's Concordance. And they're big on the Strong's Concordance. So using that little tag, they deduced that Eve was physically seduced by the serpent, or Satan, or one of those pre-existent beings, and the result of that was Cain. And for this explains everything for them. Why did Cain slay his brother? Well, because his derivation. And why did God refuse Cain's sacrifice and make him angry enough to slay his brother? Well, it was because Cain's parentage. So Cain is banished for slaying his brother, and this also explains who was it that Cain married. You know, I remember as a kid puzzling over that. Gee, you know, if Adam and Eve were the first people, who did Cain marry? Well, they figured that out too. And that was those pre-existent people of the first creation. And it is from this line that the Jewish people are derived. And so Jewish people get involved in a conspiracy theory that goes back to the beginning of time. On the other side, Adam and Eve went on to have Seth. Seth leads to the line of Noah, Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Jacob, and Jacob to Israel, and Israel to Europe, and Europe to the United States. And that's how the line is made. Yes, sir. Who did Seth marry?
We married on that side.
And by the way, the beginning of time here is 6,000 years ago.
6,000 years ago.
Creation of white people. So,
Right. Yeah. Although I've heard identity ministers who embrace evolution.
Could you say a little bit more about Jim Ahus' book? I don't think he's the member of this Christian identity.
About who?
James Ahus' book.
Oh, James Ahos' book. Oh no, he's a sociologist in Idaho, and he's written a book called The Politics of Righteousness, and that's where this chart came from. And it's very interesting. It's a good book. I highly recommend it. Okay. Their approach to the Bible is very sort of holistic. They maintain that the Old Testament cannot be separated from the New Testament. In general, I think the Christian community considers themselves Christian, therefore they rely on what they consider a Christ-centered reading of the Bible, that the Bible is a depiction of a history of man's relationship with God leading up to its culmination in Jesus Christ and the message that he brought to the world. And that's kind of a traditional Christian understanding. Their understanding of the Bible is that the Old Testament is just as valid as the New. The New Covenant really doesn't mean that much, and that God does not contradict himself and God does not change. The Old Testament is just as valid as the New, so that we ought to be following the laws of the Old Testament. And it is upon the laws of the Old Testament that they base their beliefs in common law and common law courts. And that's why you see identity coming up so much in your in the things that you read about common law courts and in some of the other presentations that you've seen this weekend. And let's do the laws. Capital offenses requiring the death penalty under the laws of God, and this was taken out of a Jubilee, which is an identity publication out of Mid-Pines, California. They have a tabloid. Capital offenses requiring the death penalty. Idolatry, false prophets, witches and wizards, blasphemy, Sabbath breaking, murder, human sacrifice, abortionists, death from miscarriage due to assault, adultery, unchastity of bride, Hurish priest's daughter, rape of betrothed virgin or married woman, incest, bestiality and interracial sex, homosexuality, kidnapping, false witness concerning a capital offense, striking or cursing your mother or father, stubborn and rebellious son, oppressing the poor and practicing usury, which is the charging of interest on loans, and the refusal to obey the sentence of judgment. I always like to pause here and look around the room and see which of us would not be here under this list. Which I would not be here, but I'm not going to tell you under which one. Yeah, I'll hide under that one. That's good. This is a map that came up recently in ClanWatch showing what the known identity congregations and compounds scattered across the United States. And it's a pretty wide distribution. Some of the things that I get from over here, and some of them come from over here, and most of them actually come from Pete Peters in Wyoming. He's my favorite. This is deceptive, though, because most of these compounds or congregations, identity has become just absolutely ingenious at getting the word out using the new access to electronic media that they have. They have internet sites, mail order catalogs and things. They have the tape distribution. We have an identity minister on satellite television. His name is Arnold Murray. His show is called The Shepherd's Chapel. It's on Monday through Friday through satellite TV. SCN, I guess, is the network. And we get calls into our office. We got one a few months ago from some women in Paradise Valley, Montana. In rural communities, a lot of satellite dishes are up, to get reception for these programs. And these women had been studying together for years. And a couple of them had begun watching Arnold Murray's program. They started sending away for the tapes. Pretty soon they're bringing the tapes into the Bible study. And one of the women happened to read about a presentation I made in Livingston, and she said, gosh, this sounds kind of like Arnold Murray. And it was a very embarrassing thing, actually, because once these women found out what he represented and the logical extension of all his ideas, regardless of how scholarly his exegesis of Genesis sounded, it was a white supremacist religion, and that is kind of the essence of what identity is. It is white supremacists first, and what they've done is paste a veneer of Christianity over the top of it. And that's why they rely so heavily on this cut and paste technique of putting together these disparate ideas. And it's very labor intensive. So the scholarship sounds very convincing. It sounds like, wow, they can quote this and they can do that and they can pull this over here. But it's a very labor intensive process, and they have to work very hard at it. I think it was Danny Levitas that made the point that these guys, they're very literate and they're very good at being convincing about their evidence and what they present. Shepherd's Chapel. Identity ministers get asked the question, gosh, if this is the truth and it's right here under our noses, what's been going on all this time? How come the mainline denominations aren't preaching this? What are they doing? What's going on? And this is a cartoon from one of Pete Peters' books. It's called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And they're referred to the mainline denominations and even the fundamentalist denominations as Baal religion or Baal. And it shows a mainline minister with a big peace sign on his robe. And the Bible here sitting on the thing, it's got cobwebs on it because, we never read the Bible. And it says, the law has been nailed to the cross. God is love. Grace, peace, and tolerance is where it's at. Judge not. And the audience is the church treasurer and a government bureaucrat. And his reward is a big stack of money. Clergy always like this one. They always think, oh, yeah, right, we get all kinds of money. And that's their reward from the church treasurer. It says, good message, keep it up, and we'll keep you on the payroll. And the government bureaucrat is handing over the tax-exempt status. And it says, we believe your ministry qualifies for one of these. And the reason that is that the Jewish conspiracy is controlling the government. And the government wants these guys to preach messages of love and tolerance so that they can continue on their conspiracy. And it all boils back down to the Jewish conspiracy theory. And the result of this collusion between prophet, priest, and king, as Pete Peters calls it, is everything you can imagine. Crime, gay rights, abortion, interracial marriage, very high on their list of crime. Yes?
One of the things that I've heard said from that line of thought is that if a church is incorporated, they're just an agent of the state.
Yes.
Right.
And
Which
so
is-
therefore, and I mean, almost all churches are incorporated now because it's hard to keep your, I guess you can get a tax exempt status without it, but it's a little bit more difficult. So.
And they do have their own organization of unincorporated churches, and they get together regularly and talk shop.
I don't want to take you off on another tangent, but I want to ask you a question. Campus Crusade for Christ, how they fit in, do you know anything about that?
Campus Crusade for Christ is not related to Christian identity. It's probably more fundamentalist in its orientation toward student organizing and evangelizing. But the only thing they might have in common is they're very anti-gay rights, gay and lesbian rights. Yes.
As far as that goes, actually, I've heard a lot of Christian identity people and like-minded people really put down groups like Campus Crusade for Christ as being tools of Satan.
The fundamentalist denomination are seen as being dupes of this kind of conspiracy because of one thing, and not one thing, but because of the rapture theory primarily. They feel like the rapture, and if you're not familiar with the rapture theory in fundamentalist denominations, it maintains that, you know, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ is going to come again. And when he does come again, it's going to be around the millennia, or maybe not at any specific time, nobody knows, although some people think they do. And when he comes again, he is going to lift up all the believing Christians off the world so they won't have to endure the tribulations. And those who are left behind are left to endure whatever is going to happen. And in their case, in some cases, it's going to be a racial holy war. And then he'll come back after it's all over with the remnant, the people who survive, and establish his kingdom on earth. Premillennialism. Premillennial, yeah.
As opposed to motion.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So not all people, not all identity ministers spend a lot of time in this sort of apocalyptic theory, but they do believe that the rapture is unbiblical. And they hate it because it lulls people, they say, into a false sense of complacency. That if you believe you're going to be raptured off the planet, no worries. You don't have to stockpile weapons. You don't have to do paramilitary training. You don't have to get the stuff in the basement and get ready. So they want action. Yes, sir.
Haven't they recently come out with the Christian Identity Bible? Have they just now, I've heard.
Oh, is that right?
It's just now written down.
It's called the
Probably
Atlantic
trying to
version.
avoid some of these questions.
Oh, yeah. That'd be great. I'll have to
And
get
it's
it.
put out by Pete Peters, actually.
Oh, good. Watch your bookshelves for this one. This is a copy of Pete Peters' book, The Death Penalty for Homosexuals is Prescribed in the Bible. They're kind of selective about which of those capital laws they really want to push, and this is one of the very first that they really go for. Pete Peters has been very active in trying to fight rights for gay and lesbians in Wyoming. It's kind of a wheel we use. Tarso Ramos gave an excellent presentation yesterday on the wise use movement and how the wise use is using, or this identity is actually using wise use as part of their effort to mainstream their ideas, get out into a broader audience, find people who are susceptible, and pull them further and further into their movement. Because what you have here is this incredible combination of guns, of motivation, of fervor, religious fervor, and we all know what religion can do in fanaticizing people and making them very dangerous when they're in an all-encompassing belief system. So identity is motivated. They are pushing into these little areas. And one of them is anti-environmentalism through the wise use movement. In fact, he was at a meeting where they featured Sheldon Emery as a speaker, and Sheldon Emery was selling his books at the meeting, The Curse of the Canaanites, which refers to the Jewish conspiracy. So they're anti-environmentalism, and Pete Peters' take on it is that environmentalism is essentially a communist construct, that it's all part of the New World Order to enforce communism and to steal our rights, and it's part of a land grab. The New World Order wants to control as much land as possible, and they're going to use environmentalism to do that. They have it designated a wilderness area, and they keep it for themselves. So anti-environmentalism, gun control. The one thing that in the history of these kinds of organizations, from the Posse Comitatus to the Freemen, the real thing that got folks sensitized was the Brady Bill. And that has been a #1 recruiting issue for the militia of Montana, for example. So gun control. Anti-federal government, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. Survivalist. Obviously, they're preparing for the big one, so you have to have all this stuff in the basement along with your guns and your training. So they like to go to preparedness expos and do the recruiting in those areas. Apocalyptic. Some identity preachers spend more time on this than others. Some of them spend a lot of time, like James Wickstrom, who was with the Posse Comitatus, will talk about, you know, this racial holy war and the minority hordes waiting to march into the country. So they preach that to put fear into people and get them motivated to go out and do what they want them to do. Biblical fundamentalism. In James Aho's studies of the Idaho Christian Patriots, he found that one of the primary predisposers towards some of these ideas being able to be recruited deeper into the movement would be biblical fundamentalism. And I'll put his chart up here after this. More so than some folks were saying that maybe the Mormon community, but that was just because there were more Mormons in Idaho. But proportionately, a fundamentalist background was more conducive. And when Pete Peters was advertising this latest meeting in Estes Park, Colorado, he was kind of he's trying to bridge that gap and reach over into some of those denominations and pull those preachers into the identity fold. One of the examples was Sylvan Ramsey, who is an identity minister now in Missouri, who's got his own thing going. He was, I guess he was a Baptist minister, and he had his own home school, and he ran into problems with accreditation things with state regulations, and he got thrown in jail for it. And while he was there, he kind of got onto the identity message, came out, started his own church and his own identity school, the Saxon University. And he's now in the identity camp. Here's his little ad. I'll just click this up here real quick. Not multicultural. At least, you know, let's not mince words here. They never come right out and say that. You know, when Pete had this thing in Colorado and they were kind of recruiting, I sent in a thing. I tried to register, and they sent me back a note that said, "We can't accept your application at this time." And it was, yeah, their women were not accepted. Okay. Constitutional fundamentalism, and this is kind of a term that takes in that sacred aspect that the Constitution has taken on and the organic Constitution up to the 10th Amendment. Anti-immigration, that's a pretty obvious one, feeding into anti-immigration efforts, and tax protest. The tax protest community has been a great recruiting and mainlining effort. Anti-feminist. These guys not only believe that women have overstepped their bounds, they believe that women should never hold a job outside the home, and they should never, ever be in any position of authority over a man. So that would eliminate women clergy, of course, and everything else. So it's very anti-feminist. And some of the stuff that I listen to is downright misogynistic. Pete Peters talking about how women are a bunch of flatterers and liars. It's a really, really negative and disgusting view of women. Essentially, yeah. And the racist thing, of course, is pretty obvious. And there's two on here that do belong on here. One is anti-choice. Anti-choice efforts. I'm blocking on the name of the man that shot the doctor in Florida. The version. Was it Rick Hill? Paul Hill. I keep wanting to say Rick Hill because he's running for office in Montana. Anyway, Paul Hill, and he has some similarities. But Paul Hill described himself as a Phineas priest in some of these things. And we'll get into that and how identity is sort of making these guys into saints, people who commit crimes, murder, and things like that under their beliefs. We'll go right directly into Phineas priest after this. And then it is also anti-public education. They jump right in with both feet when they hear these attacks on public education. And you can see where this is opening a big entree into getting into some of the more right-wing religious organizations around the country. And before we get into that, Pat Robertson's New World Order. They were pretty excited about this book. They think that there is excellent recruiting potential in the Reconstructionist movement based on the fact that Pat Robertson uses a lot of the same scholarship, for example, Nesta Webster's piece on the Illuminati concept that was discredited years ago, but that whole kind of international conspiracy thing, that's the kind of scholarship he uses in his book to support his New World Order agenda. And it is very anti-public education also. So there's lots of bridge issues for them to exploit. They know it, and they see it, and they're going after it. The Phineas priesthood is something that's a pretty hot topic here in Spokane right now. So we'll talk about those guys. Phineas priesthood centers their name and their justification around Numbers 25 in the Bible. And Numbers 25 describes how the tribes of Israel are being beset by plague after plague after plague. And the priests get in front of the folks and say, the reason this is happening is because you've been marrying with the women of other tribes, you've been worshiping pagan gods as a result, and now God is angry and he's hitting us with all these plagues. At that time, a man walked into the room with his Midianite wife, a woman from another tribe. And Phineas jumped up and ran a spear through the both of them. Their interpretation of that particular passage is that that is a law against interracial marriage. Most folks would read that as taking on pagan gods or putting other gods before our God or whatever, but their interpretation is interracial marriage. And so that is also their interpretation is that you have to take the law into your own hands. These guys follow biblical law as interpreted by them, and they are above the laws of the land. This is really a great thing for prison recruiting, because you can go into a prison and say, you're not a criminal, you're not a thug or a murderer, you're a priest. By golly, you're just upholding your religious beliefs for what you did. This book on the cover, it says, as the kamikaze is to the Japanese, as the Shiite is to Islam, as the Zionist is to the Jews, so the Phineas priest is to Christendom. And inside it goes into a whole history of crimes and violence and really pretty horrible stuff. At the beginning of the book, I want to put up the symbol. It's called The Vigilantes of Christendom. It is written by Richard Kelly Hoskins. He lives in Virginia. And I bought this book at a Militia of Montana meeting in Bozeman. The publisher is.
Do they have their own publication?
The Virginia Publishing Company. Lynchburg, Virginia.
You can get that book in a special for $2 if you want to. They've got the
Is that right?
That's where I got my copy.
Well, this book scares the hell out of me because any person, any thug, any murderer out there can read this book and say, well, hey, what a great idea. This is the symbol of the Phineas priest. And sometimes what you also see is NOS Numbers 25 added on to that.
What else do you see? I'm sorry.
They'll use the abbreviation for Numbers 25. Bill Moreland caught a guy at a gun show wearing a belt buckle with a Phineas priest symbol on it, and underneath it says Numbers 25. And sometimes they use the little symbol numbers, too. I point this out because it's turning up. When I did a presentation, kind of like that. Sometimes they use that symbol, too. When I gave this presentation in Stevensville in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana the other night, they're having a lot of problems with the Patriots in their community. They've gone from the filing of liens to filing actual lawsuits against the county attorney and the police chief and other folks in the community. And they're pretty sensitized to some of the issues. And we did the presentation, and we got to this part where I put up the symbol. And the police chief came up to me afterward, and he said, I've seen those here. They're around. And he hadn't known what it meant before or what it represented, but now he knows. So it's something to look out for. In Stevensville. What are we doing for time? Oh, we've got 5 minutes, so we better stop and do questions. Oh, do it? Oh, great. Well, let me keep going then. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, the flow chart. Process of recruitment. This was, I think this particular kind of a model of flow chart is used by sociologists. Let's do this. And this was what he put together. Process of recruitment. No, I don't. This is out of Aho's book. So it's, and it says up here, the candidate not raised in a conservative or fundamentalist troop. So the first determinant is a fundamentalist background. It goes into socialized to a conservative fundamentalist outlook, becomes aware of the conflict between religious standards and the world, becomes a seeker of change. And the next critical point, and that's what's critical to our beliefs about why we have this presentation, is access. Access to a radical opportunity structure. It used to be when folks were recruited to groups like the Ku Klux Klan, it was through a friend or relative, somebody direct contact with someone who's already involved. What we have now is access through mail order, access through satellite television, access through the internet, access to and through different avenues that just were not available before.
And it's access to what says, and what's the line? I can't read it.
The line says access to radical opportunity structure, family member, friend, co-worker, cellmate, lover in the movement. And they can refuse to join, or they accept invitation to affiliation, and then it becomes increasingly isolated. And this is what we saw happen with the Freemen in Montana. They're part of the community. They were talking this stuff. Folks didn't really know where they were coming from, like, boy, you know, so-and-so's off on a real tangent. But in rural communities, there is this, you know, people live right there, and they have to deal with each other on a day-to-day basis, and they learn to accept each other's idiosyncrasies and their flaws. And it was one of those things, if you don't know where they're coming from, if you don't know what it is they're talking about, it's easy to say, well, so-and-so's getting off on a little loopy thing here, but they're tolerant about it. So the Freemen found themselves getting deeper and deeper and deeper, reading identity stuff, reading the Posse Comitatus materials, listening to James Wickstrom tapes, and finding them out further and further on the branch until they're out there all by themselves. Yes?
They're also doing a lot of heavy recruiting in the prison system.
At the last jubilation, one of their big focuses is prison recruiting, and they had a big auction. And the jubilation is a gathering of identity believers from all over the United States. This year they met in Lake Tahoe. They had Louis Beam there, and you can imagine Louis Beam's message, and it wasn't about white supremacists, it was about no king but Jesus. Using that religious pull to recruit into the movement. It's very folksy and homey, and he's an excellent speaker, but that was the theme, was no king but Jesus. And as part of that, they had a big auction for their prison ministries, and they have June Lily Holt there, a perky little woman who does this little mail thing with the prisoners. And they lined up every person who attended this jubilation with their buddy in prison. And one of the buddies, so-called buddies, was it Bruce Carroll? Was it Dewey, one of the 10 members of the order that went on the crime spree in the 80s. Another, the television station that sent in another undercover agent, the guy was wearing a little like video cam in his hat because they did not allow media into this jubilation. And they were assigned their little prison buddy, and it turned out to be a convicted child molester. So the very frightening thing about this is not just the fact that they're sort of glorifying crime, is that they are recruiting the very most dangerous people you can possibly think of into the movement. Yes?
These aren't stupid people. Hasn't it occurred to them that if these people get out, that they're not going to just do their bidding, but that they are recruiting people who might be very dangerous within their own ranks?
They don't seem to have any worries that I've ever read about. No, I've not heard any. Yes?
Is there any addressing of the fact that they're recruiting the people who are punishable by death according to their list of lawless sins?
Well, it depends on which crime you committed. If you murdered in... Well, she was referring back to the list of capital punishments. Crimes punishable by death. And I guess it depends on what kind of a crime you committed. I guess it doesn't say anything on there about child molestation. And it doesn't say anything about murdering an interracial couple. Because if you're enforcing God's law, you can break the law, and it's a paradox, but that's okay for them. Any other questions? There seems to be a lot of questions, so let's just do it. What?
In the prison ministries that they're conducting, do you find, or have you heard of, or has anyone heard of, any coordination between motorcycle gangs and, especially on the West Coast here, and the Christian identity movement, the Patriot movement?
I haven't heard any. Yes, sir?
Up in one of our counties, Valley County, supposedly now, the Hells Angels are being trained by militia /
Hells Angels being trained by militia.
And I found that out through one of our prisoners.
Wow, there's lots. Let me scan this thing.
On that topic real quick, I've seen photographs of members of our motorcycle gangs doing surveillance at Reverend Mother's compound in Eagle Lane. The Hells Angels will wear an AB pin to the penitentiary, which is the Aryan Brotherhood. They do closely apply themselves to the Aryan Brotherhood.
The Hells Angels do. And in this particular area, or?
General area, mostly down in the
General?
California area, down in the prison system down through there. But are they actually members of Hells Angels or just some outlaw bikers? No, they're actual. I mean, which group? The photographs? Well, when you're talking about Hells Angels doing security, are they actual members of Hells Angels or are they just some outlaw bikers? Those were gypsy jokers. Okay, well, that's out of be afraid of.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't remember his name. The Jewish rabbi who wrote the book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? What's his name? Kushner. He has a new book, How Good Do We Have to Be? And very exciting. He talks about Genesis and his idea of how to interpret Genesis. And it's so much more palatable than anything else I've ever read. It's worth getting the book just to read the first chapter or two about Genesis. What he's saying is Genesis wasn't necessarily original sin, but was how human beings, Adam and Eve, began to be conscious human beings making choices, whereas before they ate of the fruit, they were just there and everything was great. Things can't go on like that. Anyway, it's well worth reading even to get the first chapter or two about Genesis. Maybe it's not in the beginning, but somewhere in there. Very, very good for people who want to combat the ideas of using Genesis.
Good resource. Yes, ma'am.
In the book of Genesis, which is the Bible to the Jews, they don't refer to it as the Old Testament. It's referred to as the Old Testament by Christians because they have the New Testament. But Genesis was originally a Jewish Bible book. And it's always amazed me that Christians don't refer to Jews to help them understand Genesis. After all, it's their book, right? Their original Bible. Jews see Genesis as symbolic and not real.
And identity considers that part of the thing, that there is no such thing as Judeo-Christianity, and that is all part of the conspiracy. But I understand Leonard Zeskin has done some work around that, too.
But again, Jews see it as very symbolic and not literal, and so the interpretation they take on the Bible or Genesis is very, very different when you see these things as a literal interpretation.
It's a unique interpretation. Yes?
Thank you for reaching out to a secular organization, because to an atheist, that sounds like madness and mental illness. Also, is the Promise Keepers?
No, they're not. And we've had a lot of questions about Promise Keepers. The Promise Keepers, most of the arguments center around the fact that women have been excluded. There have been some speakers who talk about men retaking their place at the head of the household, and a lot of folks have taken exception to that. The MAC, the judicatory leaders, met with Promise Keeper leaders to talk about some of those issues, and they said that they were genuinely trying to address these problems, and they have gotten away from those statements. But I had the UCC minister there said, you know, I spend all my life trying to break down these kinds of walls, and here they are being put up again, and it just seems frustrating. So it's not related, but it does come up a lot, Promise Keepers. Yes, sir?
What's your assessment on the gospel file ministry?
The
Gospel Plow.
Gospel Plow. I'm not familiar with the Gospel Plow ministry. Where are they at?
They're in eastern Colorado.
Uh-huh.
And when I first encountered some of their teachings, I was intrigued because about 3/4 of the way down the list of the things that they held important was a very large file on a Christian gun owner's manual. And they were arguing that it was biblically necessary and imperative for all Christians to be heavily armed, to own as many guns as possible. I haven't had much experience with it before, and that was the first time I had seen it.
Lynn, do you have
I don't know specifically about that, but there are a large number of Christian ministries that are not in the Christian identity mindset, but they're about 1 or 2 steps away from it. It's really fundamentalist, very separatist orientation, but they also reject Christian identity.
Mm-hmm. And they might be picking up the patriot themes that we hear being replayed, but they're not buying into the theology. And identity is very self-aware about the role that they play in a lot of this stuff. I have, this is Resistance Magazine, a skinhead publication, and the editor writes that, as an atheist, I choose to still work with the identity movement. And Pete Peters, I have a tape of him talking about liking the term Israel identity even better than Christian identity, because there are a lot of people involved with identity who are not Christian, and that's a fact. So it's like, this is not really a spiritual outreach. This is an outreach to like-minded people, and it doesn't matter what you really believe, but we are going to be your vehicle. We are going to get you in. Yes, ma'am.
And Snohomish County, in terms of the bikers, what we found in the gang scene is that the Christian identity was sneaking in with the fundamentalist Christians and recruiting the youth. And then it came back to that these white gangs were being overseen by old bikers, 50 years of age plus, who were recruiting them. And part of their dogma was it was okay to sell drugs to the other people because, people of colors and other gangs and all of that, because they were beneath them. So it was that they said that it was actually okay for them to make money this way, and perpetuated this idea. It was interesting how they snuck into the whole gang scene, and that you needed other white people around you to protect you, because the other gang scene was already pretty much in place, and part of their thing was intimidation. So it was a justifiable thing, and it was Main Street, Bellevue, Washington, sort of scene, not just Snohomish County.
It's amazing how so few people who are well motivated and have their path laid out for them in a very narrow construct can influence so many different avenues. And you'll see it. You scratch below the surface and you can see it all over the place. Yes? Yes?
Are you familiar with the guy named Rushdoony?
Rushdoony? Yes.
He has a list of capital punishable offenses. So similar to speak at. Is he part of identity as well, or
He's the father of the Reconstructionist movement. Most of Pat Robertson's stuff is based on the teachings of Rushdoony and those ideas.
But here's a little interesting tidbit. He is the primary theological consultant on PAC, the Black Action Committee.
He's a primary political consultant on a political action committee?
Called Impact.
Impact, yeah.
Which Ellen Gradwell on the board.
Well, he's involved with a lot more than that.
Would you spell his last name? Is it Dooney, D-U-C?
R-U-S-H-D.
Yes, sir.
That's R.J. Rushdoony.
First name is
Following-
Rousas, R-O-U-S-A-S.
Following the keynote speakers, admonition not to be silent friends, what would you suggest that we can all do with that in our community? So we never enlist in mainline religious organizations, Christian or Jewish or otherwise, to this problem, so that together they can reach out to that middle disaffected or that extreme disaffected part that's being attracted or being recruited by us.
Well, there's Montana Association of Churches started my program to do that. And when I go into a small rural community where a lot of folks haven't heard of some of these things, I even have to explain what the term Aryan nations represents. we do some education to kind of short circuit that progression if it might come up, you know, especially with folks who might be already involved in the John Birch Society. But I know that Pastor Dave Ostendorf has the Center for New Community out of Chicago, Illinois. He does teaching around this topic. The National Council of Churches adopted Leonard Zeskin's book and worked with him in trying to educate. So there is stuff going on within the Christian community already. And there are some resources available.
Within the Northwest.
Within the Northwest.
Idaho or Washington, Montana or Colorado. Are there specific organizations that have taken on this as their call? Specific people?
Yes, ours, and through any human rights organization, the Northwest Coalition, the Montana Human Rights Network, they all have lots of information about Christian identity. And they do, you know, I've heard it through everything I've listened to in these last couple of days as far as how identity crops up and how it works into this. But as far as one whole clearinghouse, I think for the Christian community, for the church anyway, I'm in. Yes, ma'am.
We're from Montana.
Yeah.
Equality and Human Rights Task Force in Reno County, and there is a Church of the Creator compound right outside of Superior, Montana. Could you expand a little bit on the
You
Church
bet.
of the Creator?
These guys are from Montana, and there is a Church of the Creator compound just outside of Superior. And Church of the Creator is one of those phrases. They're using the name, but they're really not a church. There's no ritual, there's no building, there's no real spiritual outreach going on. They just like to call it Church of the Creator, and I think Ben Clausen named it that so he could call himself the Pontificus Maximus. It's essentially social Darwinism, which is your only real allegiance is to your species, and your species, even though it doesn't hold up biologically, is the white race. So they feel like these other races are competitors with the white race, and you have to do what you have to do to survive ultimately. They also contain good gardening hints and dietary hints and stuff like that, but it's very viciously racist and it's very viciously anti-Semitic. They quote from the protocols in this book. This is Nature's Eternal Religion. Ben wrote this. He's since passed away and has handed on his so-called ministry to other folks, and one of the main guys in Montana is Rudy Stanko. And Rudy Stanko was recruited in prison while he was doing time for selling tainted beef to school lunch programs. And and it's very interesting that Rudy gets around, and he's left these books all over Montana, so I have copies of lots of these. But it's not really a church. I wouldn't call it a religious belief at all. In fact, they spend a lot of time talking about what a bunch of hooey the Bible is. So
it's not really Christian identity?
no, it's not. It's something entirely separate.
We have two magazines here. You mentioned Jubilee. There's also the Spotlight that you see a lot in the rural communities.
Yes.
Could you discuss the similarities or differences, or separate them or put them together?
The Spotlight's been around for a long time, and that's the product of Willis Carto and the Liberty Lobby. It's a populist publication, and they're into conspiracy theory and anti-Semitism more than anything else. Although I pick up identity ads in Spotlight, I pick up a lot of the Patriot stuff too. So Spotlight's, check the classifieds, are great. Well, I think I'm supposed to let you go now, so thank you very much for coming. And I'll stay for questions.